Have you ever found yourself wondering if there are, hidden forces shaping global events, maybe terms like deep state or New World Order have plopped into your head, sparking curiosity about, like, secret groups pulling the strings behind the scenes? It's an idea that really sparks the imagination, isn't it? Well, today on the Deep Dive, we're going to take a journey, explore these exact concepts. We'll dig into where they came from, how they sort of evolved in the public mind. And this is the crucial part, we're going to put those, compelling stories up against something else entirely, a really data-driven look at what's actually happening with global peace and conflict, based on a major new report. Our mission, really, is to separate those narratives from the empirical reality.
Yeah, absolutely. And to guide us on this deep dive, we'll be looking at some key sources. We've got excerpts from Wikipedia covering both the deep state conspiracy theory in the United States and the New World Order conspiracy theory. Important context there. And then for the data side, we're diving into the full Global Peace Index 2024 report. The goal here is really to pull out the most important bits of information, the key takeaways, and bring you some hopefully much needed clarity on these really complex topics.
Okay, so let's start with the deep state. Let's unpack this one first.
Yeah.
In the U.S. context, this political conspiracy theory suggests there's a hidden network, right?
Yeah.
Often described as mostly people from the FBI and CIA. And the argument goes that this network, maybe along with leaders from finance and industry, they actually wield power alongside or maybe even inside the elected government, sort of like a shadow government operating behind the scenes, maybe even controlling official policy.
Right. And what's really interesting here is that ideas like this, similar concepts, they've been around since the 1950s at least. But the specific term deep state, that actually came about much later in the 1990s, and originally it referred to anti-democratic groups in Turkey. That's where it started. It only later got applied to the American government context, including during the Obama administration.
And then it really exploded into the mainstream during Donald Trump's first presidency, didn't it?
Yeah.
He famously alleged, falsely, according to critics and fact-checkers, that this deep state was actively working against him, against his agenda. And his supporters, outlets like Breitbart News, people like Steve Bannon, they really ran with that term, used it to delegitimize critics. It's also, a core belief in the QAnon movement, that pro-Trump conspiracy theory.
So that raises a big question, doesn't it? What is this deep state, if we look at it, analytically? John D. Michaels, he's a law professor at UCLA, offers a really interesting take. He argues that the American deep state is really just the American bureaucracy, plain and simple. And he points out 5 key ways it's fundamentally different from that conspiratorial view. First, he says it's not elitist. U.S. bureaucrats come from all sorts of backgrounds, unlike maybe in other parts of the world.
Okay.
Second, it's not shadowy. He argues American agencies are generally pretty transparent and accessible, certainly compared to many others.
Right.
Third, it's not monolithic. It's actually diverse, fragmented internally, lots of different agencies, sometimes competing.
I see.
Fourth, and this is key, he sees it as a bulwark, not a battering ram, meaning civil servants' actions are usually defensive, a check, not an attack. And finally, it's not some force outside the Constitution. He sees the bureaucracy as part of the system of checks and balances, sometimes the last check on overreach.
So he's basically saying what some people are calling a deep state is actually, it's a feature, not a bug, a built-in safeguard. That really does shift the perspective. Yeah, it lines up pretty well with what political scientist George Friedman said, too, that the civil service was, created by law specifically to limit presidential power. So it's not some secret plot, it's part of the design.
Exactly. That's one major analytical viewpoint. But it's important to say there are other perspectives on hidden power structures, too. We should mention those. For example, historian Alfred W. McCoy argues that the U.S. intelligence community, since 9/11, its power has grown so much that it's basically become a fourth branch of the U.S. government, one that's, quote, autonomous from the executive.
Oh, okay.
And then there's Michael J. Glennon, a professor at Tufts. He talks about a double government. He pointed to President Obama's inability to close Guantanamo Bay as sort of evidence that these deeper structures can resist even what the president wants.
Right. And just to cover all the bases, our sources mention a few other related terms people might hear. Mike Lofgren defines the deep state a bit differently as this hybrid mix of government, finance, and industry, governing without our consent, essentially. Jason Lindsay uses the term dark state for networks serving capital, hidden from the public. And Tom Engelhardt talks about that fourth branch idea, too, unchecked, unaccountable, working in secret. And Lofgren, interestingly, points to the military-industrial complex as the private sector part of his deep state. Okay, we've got these different definitions, different analyses. It paints a really complex picture, doesn't it? How power actually works inside a government. It ranges from like intended constitutional checks
Yeah.
all the way to potentially unchecked, really influential forces. It seems like it's more of a spectrum of interpretation than one single thing.
Absolutely. And the key, I think, for you listening is recognizing these nuances. It means understanding that while, yes, systems of influence and bureaucracy are very real, the conspiracy narratives often oversimplify them or, misrepresent how they actually function and how broad their scope really is.
That makes sense.
Oh,
Okay, let's pivot now. Let's broaden out to an even bigger concept, the New World Order conspiracy theory.
right. Now, historically, back in the early 20th century, the phrase New World Order was used completely differently. You had political leaders like Woodrow Wilson after World War I, Winston Churchill after World War II. They used it to talk about these big shifts, these new eras in global politics and power balances. This thinking led to things like the League of Nations, the UN, NATO,
Yeah.
and international financial agreements like the Bretton Woods system, which set up rules after World War II. These were actually, quite idealistic ideas, proposals for managing the world better through working together, trying to prevent more wars.
It's really striking, isn't it? How a term that started so idealistically could get flipped on its head so completely.
Mm-hmm.
So during the Second Red Scare, that intense anti-communist period in the U.S., mid-century the term got grabbed for conspiracy theories. William Guy Carr, a Canadian theorist, was apparently a big influence here.
Yes.
And these theories started spreading fear about groups like Freemasons, the Illuminati, Jewish people,
Mm-hmm.
claiming they were secretly driving an international communist conspiracy.
Mm.
The end goal being this atheistic, bureaucratic, collectivist world government, which they call the Red Menace.
Yeah, and on the political right in the U.S., this sort of evolved. The idea became that liberals and progressives, through things like the welfare state, international cooperation, foreign aid, they were supposedly, maybe unintentionally, maybe not, paving the way for this gradual global collectivism. There's that famous quote from James Warburg in 1950 to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He said, "We shall have world government, whether or not we like it. The question is only whether world government will be achieved by consent or by conquest." Quite provocative.
Wow. Yeah, and these theories started naming names, connecting specific groups. You had right-wing populist groups like the John Birch Society, pushing anti-communism and limited government, and writers like Mary M. Davison. In her 1966 booklet, The Profound Revolution, she traced this whole alleged NWO conspiracy back to international bankers, claiming they set up the U.S. Federal Reserve in 1913 and the Council on Foreign Relations in 1921, basically as a shadow government.
Then, after communism fell in the early 90s, the target of these New World Order theories kind of shifted. It wasn't so much about hitting communists anymore, it became about globalists.
Yeah.
These globalists were seen as plotting to bring in this collectivist world government, but controlled by, an untouchable elite, international bankers, corrupt politicians, big corporations, or maybe the UN itself.
And Pat Robertson, the American televangelist, his 1991 book, The New World Order, was huge, a bestseller. It really pushed these ideas into the mainstream. He pointed fingers at Wall Street, the Fed, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Bilderberg Group, the Trilateral Commission, said they were all controlling events, pushing us towards a world government ruled by the Antichrist. And that kind of charged language, it definitely fueled the rise of the American militia movement back then.
And along with the theory came these common fears, things you still hear echoes of today, like gun control laws are really about confiscating all guns. Or that FEMA, the Emergency Management Agency, has secret camps ready to lock up anyone who resists.
Right.
There's also the belief, held by some, that the 9/11 attacks weren't what they seemed, that they were a false flag operation, carried out by U.S. intelligence itself, supposedly to justify cracking down politically and launching wars.
But of course, skeptics push back hard against all this. Historian Richard Landis points out that new technologies often cause this kind of alarmism, especially among people expecting the end times. He reminds us how fears about Y2K, barcodes, even social security numbers, they all fizzled out as people got used to them. And while, civil liberties groups raised totally valid concerns about things like private companies doing surveillance, skeptics warn us not to just lump those real concerns in with, outright paranoia or religious fears.
So, just to sum up who the alleged bad guys are in this big NWO theory, it's often described as these established, wealthy families and influential groups. You hear names like the Bilderberg Group, that private annual meeting of powerful people, the Bohemian Club, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission. The
Mhm.
claim is they're all plotting this totalitarian New World Order, an authoritarian world government run by the UN and a global central bank. And they maintain power through, controlling finance, owning the media, mass surveillance, even state terrorism. It's interesting David Rockefeller himself actually addressed this, denying he was ruler of the world, just wishing governments would cooperate more. And even on something like the Council on Foreign Relations, you get wildly different views. Is it an imperial brain trust pulling strings or just a policy discussion forum? Depends who you ask.
It's really fascinating how these powerful stories, even when they're based on, like, misinterpretations or distortions, can genuinely shape fear and political action. It just underlines how important it is to understand not just what a term means, but how it gets used and manipulated over time for different agendas.
Absolutely. That perception of control, even if it's flawed, can have a huge impact on how people feel and behave politically.
Okay. So we've journeyed through these compelling, sometimes disturbing narratives of hidden control. Now it's time to really ground ourselves. Let's look at the cold, hard data. What does the latest Global Peace Index actually tell us when we hold it up against these theories? Here's where it gets really interesting.
Right. So we're shifting gears to the findings from the Institute for Economics and Peace, or IEP. They're an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank. Their whole focus is shifting the world towards peace. And their Global Peace Index, the GPI, it's a really solid composite index. It uses 23 different indicators to measure the absence of violence or even just the fear of violence. It's designed to give us a pretty comprehensive snapshot of how peaceful a country actually is.
And the big headline finding from the 2024 report, it's pretty stark. The average level of peacefulness across countries, it actually got worse, deteriorated by about 0.5%. And this is the fifth year in a row it's gone down. What's really striking is that 97 countries got worse this year. That's the most ever recorded since the index started. Only 65 improved. So this isn't a small thing. It points to a significant negative global trend.
Yeah, it really does. And digging into the details a bit, peacefulness actually got slightly better on the safety and security domain, think crime rates, things like that. But it got worse on both ongoing conflict and militarization, and those dragged the average down. The main things driving this fall. The report points squarely at the conflict in Gaza and the ongoing war in Ukraine. We saw average scores getting worse by over 3% on several key indicators. UN peacekeeping funding went down, military spending as a chunk of GDP went up, deaths from internal conflict went up, external conflicts fought went up. The biggest single drop was actually in funding for UN peacekeeping.
And what about different regions? How'd they fare?
Well, North America actually saw the biggest drop regionally. Both Canada and the US saw large falls in peacefulness, apparently driven by increases in violent crime and how much crime people perceive.
Right.
The Middle East and North Africa, that remains the least peaceful region overall. It's home to 4 of the 10 least peaceful countries in the world, including the bottom 2, Sudan and Yemen. Europe is still the most peaceful region. 7 of the top 10 most peaceful countries are there. But even Europe got less peaceful over the past year. It had its biggest yearly drop in the militarization domain since the GPI began back in 2008. Likely reflecting responses to Ukraine.
And finally, Iceland. It's still the most peaceful country in the world. Held that spot for a long time. Though its score did dip slightly this year due to a small increase in violent demonstrations.
And let's talk about the cost, the economic impact of all this violence. It was estimated at a massive $19.1 trillion in 2023.
Trillion? Wow.
Yeah, trillion with a T. That's like 13.5% of the entire global economy, or about $2,380 for every single person on Earth. And that number went up by $158 billion from the year before, mostly because of a 20% jump in GDP losses directly from conflict. Countries like Ukraine, Afghanistan, North Korea, they're feeling the highest economic cost relative to their size.
And here's a comparison that it floors me every time I see it in the report. The money spent on actual peace building and peacekeeping, about $49.6 billion in 2023.
Tiny in comparison.
It's less than 0.6% of what the world spent on militaries. Military and internal security spending makes up over 74% of that huge $19 trillion economic impact. Military spending alone is $8.4 trillion, 44% of the total cost. That imbalance, It just screams that the global priority is military force, not building peace.
It really does. And if you look at the long-term trends from 2008 to 2023, the picture gets even bleaker in some ways. Deaths from conflict, up 482%.
Big grief.
GDP losses from conflict, up 242%. The number of refugees and internally displaced people, up 170%. Terrorism's economic impact, up 108%. These aren't small changes. They show a pattern of escalating instability over the last decade and a half.
Which brings us neatly to what the report says about war in the 21st century, how it's changing. Battle deaths hit a 30-year high in 2022. That's staggering. And the number of active conflicts is higher now than any time since World War II ended. 56 state-based conflicts were active in 2022.
And it's not just the number, it's how these conflicts end, or don't end. Back in the 1970s, about half of conflicts ended with a clear winner, a decisive victory. By the 2010s, that number had plummeted to less than 9%. And conflicts ending with a peace agreement, that's also fallen significantly, from 23% down to just over 4%.
So how do they end?
Increasingly, they don't really end. They just sort of fizzle out into low activity, meaning fewer than 25 deaths a year, but no peace deal, no victory. They become these frozen conflicts that can easily flare up again.
And another huge trend. Conflicts are getting more internationalized. 100 countries were involved, at least partially, in some kind of external conflict in the last 5 years.
Yeah, that's way up from 59 back in 2008.
So conflicts now are much more likely to have lots of different groups involved, both inside and outside the country, which you can imagine makes them way harder to resolve. Much more complex than just two sides fighting.
Exactly. And a big part of this is technology and what's called asymmetric warfare. It basically means it's easier now for smaller groups, non-state actors, or weaker states to fight bigger powers. Take drones, for example. Their use by non-state groups has just exploded, up over 1,400% since 2018.
Wow, 1,400%.
Yeah. Nearly 5,000 drone strikes by these groups recorded in 2023, causing over 3,000 deaths, up from just over 400 strikes in 2018. And look at Ukraine. They've basically pioneered a whole military branch dedicated to drone warfare. They're reportedly producing over 1 million drones this year, using them for everything. Surveillance, reconnaissance, psychological warfare, even hitting naval targets in the Black Sea. This accessible tech is fundamentally changing how wars are fought.
And the report points to 3 big geopolitical trends driving these changes. First, it's diffusion of power. The world's becoming more multipolar, no single dominant power like before, which seems to lead to longer, harder to resolve wars. Second, the problem of distraction. Big, powerful countries are just stretched thin. They can't effectively manage multiple crises at once.
Right.
And third, this continued emphasis on military solutions instead of actually tackling the root causes, the underlying grievances that fuel the conflict in the first place. And this picture, fractured power, messy cross-border conflicts, no easy wins, it just feels worlds away from that idea of a neat, tidy new world order controlling everything, doesn't it? The data suggests something much more like chaos than centralized control.
Absolutely. And we see these trends playing out in real time, in devastating conflicts happening right now. Look at Sudan. Conflict blew up in April 2023. Over 10 million people displaced already. Horrific reports of massacres, maybe 10, even hundreds of thousands killed.
Terrible.
Yemen, years of internal war, now getting worse because of the spillover from the Israel-Hamas war. Houthi attacks in the Red Sea drawing in the U.S. and UK military more directly. The Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC. Decades of conflict, 5.6 million people displaced, the M23 rebel group gaining ground, allegedly with Rwandan backing. And meanwhile, the world's biggest UN peacekeeping mission, MONUSCO, is actually pulling out because it's seen as ineffective. Show how hard these situations are.
Yeah. And Haiti. Violent gangs controlling almost half the country, most of the capital Port-au-Prince, schools, hospitals shut down. These aren't situations easily explained by a single hidden hand. They're complex tragedies driven by diffused power, external meddling, and deep-seated local problems.
So, okay, as we wrap up this deep dive, we've really looked at 2 very different ways of seeing the world, haven't we? On one hand, these powerful, compelling narratives of hidden elites, secret societies, deep states, new world orders, and on the other, the stark, measured reality of global conflict and peace, laid bare by detailed data analysis. Yeah, and the contrast is really striking. While some theories suggest this singular, shadowy force pulling the strings, the actual data on global peace paints a picture of a world that's becoming starkly disordered. It doesn't look like singular hidden forces are neatly orchestrating events. Instead, we see a fragmented, complex, and frankly deteriorating landscape. Power spreading out, Conflicts cross borders, involve more actors, and are becoming incredibly hard to stop. It's a scenario that's far messier and maybe even more frightening than any single conspiracy theory.
And understanding that difference, that contrast, is so important for all of us. It helps you listening now to critically look at the information you receive, to navigate these complex global events, and hopefully to look beyond the simple explanations for the really complicated, multi-layered challenges our world is facing. It equips you to question those big, sweeping claims and focus instead on the visible, measurable realities shaping our world.
Which leaves us with a really important question, I think. A final thought for you to consider. If global peace is getting worse because power is diffusing, because conflicts are more international and harder to solve, because technology is changing warfare, if it's that, rather than some single hidden agenda, what does that actually tell us about the true nature of power itself in the 21st century? And maybe more importantly, what role can our deeper, more nuanced understanding of these complexities play in trying to foster stability in what feels like an increasingly unpredictable world?